Hello, this is Rajesh Vedanthan from NYU Grossman School of Medicine, and I will be doing lecture 1C entitled Approaches and Disciplines for Implementation Research. No corporate disclosures. These are some of the US federal and foundation grants that I might refer to during my presentation today. And here is the lecture overview. I'll start by providing a definition and describe the transdisciplinary nature of implementation research. I have broken down the steps in implementation research to these 5 steps: identify, analyze, develop, implement, and evaluate. And during my presentation, I'll be providing examples from our own GACD funded project called BigPic, which was part of the diabetes program. So implementation research is the scientific study of methods to promote the systematic uptake of research findings and other evidence-based practices into routine practice, really with the goal of trying to improve the quality and effectiveness of health services and public health. This is a very standard definition from the mid-2000s, so almost 20 years ago, that has been the mainstay of implementation research since that time. Really, the key is that there is generally an implementation gap of evidence-based practices, and implementation research is really trying to close that implementation gap by developing and evaluating novel implementation strategies. With respect to cardiovascular disease, there is a large implementation or knowledge practice gap. Less than 10% of individuals with a stroke and less than 15% of individuals with a myocardial infarction around the world are on evidence-based therapy. So there is clearly a very large gap. This is true even if we look at the care cascade for hypertension around the world. This series of bar graphs shows you from the far left the total number of people with hypertension amongst those who have had their blood pressure ever measured, amongst those who have a confirmed diagnosis of hypertension, amongst those who have been initiated on treatment, and amongst those who have controlled blood pressure. And you can see that there's a clear drop-off in the care cascade and clear implementation gaps across the entire care cascade for hypertension in every region of the world. And now this brings us to implementation research and how we can try and close that gap. And my goal today is to share with you my thoughts on how implementation research is a transdisciplinary science that really has to bring together many independent disciplines, including qualitative methods and community-based research, quantitative methods such as biostatistics and outcomes and impact evaluation, really thinking about borrowing from our business and economics colleagues with respect to cost effectiveness research, operations research, et cetera. Really thinking about supply chain logistics in a critical manner, and really thinking about how to integrate also human performance engineering, behavioral change methods, and information and communication technology. And really the idea behind implementation research is to bring all of these different disciplines together, speaking a common language. And when we work across multiple disciplines, there are different terms that are used. Multidisciplinary, generally thought about as being sequential, independent contributions of different disciplines. Interdisciplinary, meaning a little bit more interactive with joint contributions. But really the goal and the ideal scenario for implementation research is to try and achieve what's called transdisciplinary research, where really it's an integrated, synthetic, common language that's ultimately achieved by all of these various disciplines and scientific approaches towards a cohesive whole. And then in this diagram that I put together, I have identified or sort of listed here the 5 different steps of implementation research that will borrow from all of these different fields. So identify the problem, analyze determinants, develop solutions, implement the interventions and strategies, evaluate outcomes. So let's start with identifying the problem. And there are many disciplines and approaches that can be used to identify implementation gaps or gaps in the evidence-based interventions. One is a flow chart, which you can see here on the left, related to public safety and ambulance requests, and all of the different steps required in order to actually be able to address the issues for the patients at the bottom. Here's another one where on the right, where a patient arrives at the front desk of a clinic. And again, what are the different steps required in order for the patient to ultimately be taken back into the examination room? Another method used to identify problems is the Pareto chart, which is a very nice way of being able to identify all of the different problems here, potential problems along the x-axis, and then the frequency of each of those problems along the y-axis. And what you can clearly see is that as a result of that type of analysis, probably there will be a handful of what's called the vital few issues that need to really be addressed in an urgent manner. And then what they describe as the quote unquote trivial many, or the smaller contributions that you may not necessarily have to prioritize at the outset. And so the Pareto analysis, or the Pareto chart, is a very nice way of being able to identify high priority items for intervention and addressing them. Another very popular way of doing problem analysis is called the fishbone or Ishikawa diagram, where you have your problem statement or issue that you're needing to fix on the far right, and then a series of sort of branching causes and contributing factors, et cetera, over to the left. And so again, a very nice way of being able to identify the various ways that different causes and factors are related to that problem statement. And here's an example of that, where the problem is long times related to getting the results of tests. And there are several main categories: equipment, methods, materials, people, and environment. But then inside each of those, with this branching sort of scenario, you can see that each of them has either sub-factors or sub-sub-factors that can be addressed in order to try and optimize implementation and ultimately outcomes. Next, let's move to analyzing the determinants of the problem. So once we've identified the problem, now we can analyze the determinants of that problem. And here, what I really wish to urge people to think about are what are called the social and structural determinants of health. There are many figures related to sort of depicting the relationship between social and structural determinants of health and health outcomes being at the individual level, let's say. But then, those sort of overlapping and sort of concentric types of factors that will affect people's health, including individual and lifestyle factors, community and social networks, socioeconomics, culture and environment, and the political context. And what we were trying to show here in this diagram is that sometimes trying to be able to even create culturally appropriate measures of these multi-level social determinants can be a challenge for scientists. Oftentimes, the relationship between these different social and structural determinants is non-linear, and that's what we're trying to indicate with these sort of squiggly arrows. Sometimes there can be feedback loops. And then finally, there can be different temporal relationships. So sometimes exposures to these social and structural determinants of health, let's say during childhood, may not manifest in health issues or health problems until much later in life. So there can be temporal relationships that can be challenging to model as well. But very important to consider these social and structural determinants of health, the conditions in which we live, in which we work, and in which we play, really having a dominant impact on our health. Another way to think about determinants of behavior in particular, there are many, many models for behavioral change. One of the ones that I just wish to illustrate here is called the COM-B model. COM stands for capability, motivation, and opportunity, ultimately leading to behavior. Capability, briefly defined as one's capacity or ability to perform certain behaviors. Motivation, obviously related to the psychological motivation, and opportunity related to the opportunities made available to be able to even engage in that behavior. The nice thing about the COM-B model is that it can be combined with what's called the theoretical domains framework, where you really can break down each of the different domains, capability, motivation, and opportunity, into these very specific factors and specific issues. Pictured here, for example, under capability includes knowledge, skills, memory, etc. Under motivation, things like beliefs about capabilities, goals, intentions, emotions, etc. And under opportunity, again, then this is where some of the social and structural determinants of health are very important. Some of the environmental contexts and resources and social contexts and resources as well. The other nice thing about the COM-B model is that it is related to what's called the behavior change wheel, so that each of the different domains of the COM-B model, capability, opportunity, and motivation, are now related to different types of interventions or strategies that can be attempted to be implemented in order to influence those different domains to be able to ultimately improve behavior change. And so things like regulation or fiscal measures or guidelines or environmental or social planning will have different ways of influencing capability, opportunity, and motivation, ultimately leading to behavior change. And so it's a very nice way to be able to structurally think about interventions and strategies to be able to try and influence behavior. But there are many models for behavior change. The COM-B model, theoretical domains framework, behavior change wheel is just one of literally dozens of behavior change approaches that are in the literature: health belief model, theory of planned behavior, etc. And so I think important to use whatever feels appropriate and important and contributory to the actual issue or problem at hand. What we did in our Big Pic study, where we were trying to combine group medical visits and microfinance to address poverty in the context of hypertension care, was we did a qualitative assessment of some of the factors that may influence the uptake of and the perceptions, community perceptions of group medical visits and microfinance. And what we recognize is that there are three main themes: skepticism of the health system overall, stigma related to chronic diseases, and socioeconomic fragility that would influence people's ability or desire to be able to engage in this new implementation strategy that we were trying to implement. And so this was a very helpful way of being able to use qualitative methods to be able to get those perceptions from the community members. The next stage in the process is what's called developing solutions. And here I wish to give a little bit of a side, a little bit of a detour to what I call design thinking, where we complement what we generally think of as deductive and inductive reasoning with what I like to call abductive reasoning, ultimately leading to integrative thinking, really thinking outside the box and rethinking the problem in order to rethink the solution. And my favorite example of this is the classic elevator problem. You go to any big hotel or even hospital, there's a long wait for the elevator at the bottom floor. And you can try and do all these engineering solutions using deductive and inductive reasoning, such as making them faster, making them more responsive, starting them at different levels. But the reality is that there's always a non-zero wait. So someone came along one time and said, hey, maybe the waiting is not the problem. Maybe the boredom is the problem. Maybe people are bored, and so let's address that boredom. So they put a mirror at the bottom of the elevator bank. Now, all of a sudden, people are, combing their hair, doing their makeup, checking other people out, and the boredom went away. And what you see then is that there was a proliferation of mirrors at the bottoms of these elevator banks in all of the nice hotels. The 21st century version of this obviously are the more now electronic screens with news and weather updates, but the idea is the same: rethink the problem to rethink the solution. So in the context of our trial called Big Pic, Bridging Income Generation with Group Integrated Care, we did a design team exercise as well to be able to develop this integrated group medical visit microfinance model. We brought together stakeholders representing a variety of different sort of lived experiences, people involved with nursing, people involved with pharmacy, people involved with microfinance, village leaders and chiefs, et cetera, all bringing together to sort of brainstorm different ideas that were then prototyped. We subjected them to community input and feedback. We got all sorts of great ideas from village members who were interested in this potential planned implementation strategy, ultimately being able to then develop our final model of group medical visits and microfinance. The next step is about implementing then those interventions and strategies in the settings in which you wish to do that. And again, here, in the context of implementation research, we are really trying to work with real life settings and real life contexts. And so this Tracy's tool for me is a very, or wheel is a very useful way to think about sort of the pragmatic nature of implementation research as compared to the sort of very sort of strictly controlled scientific nature of, sort of controlled laboratory-based research. So thinking about eligibility, recruitment, the setting, the organization, how flexible you need to be with respect to the delivery of the intervention or strategy, how flexible you need to be with your definition of adherence, how closely are individuals followed up, what is your primary outcome, what's your primary analysis. All of these things can be graded now on a scale of 1 through 5 that helps you determine whether it's more of an implementation research type of trial or whether it's much more of a sort of, let's say, even controlled drug trial. And the general experience for most of us in implementation research is that we are much more on the pragmatic side, where we generally tend to have a little bit more flexibility and pragmatic approach to all of these characteristics, as opposed to, let's say, a very strictly controlled pharmaceutical trial. And so I think it's just an important way to think about how you are approaching your testing and evaluation. In the context of Big Pick, again, we created a 4-arm cluster randomized trial where we had 4 different arms: usual care, microfinance, the group medical visit by itself, and then the combined group medical visit microfinance arm, following everyone for 12 months, checking blood pressures at the end, and also cardiovascular risk score reduction. There are many other sort of trial designs. The stepped wedge design is a very popular one as well, where you sequentially roll in either different individuals or different clusters into the intervention condition in order to be able to ultimately, at the end of your trial, everyone now is exposed to the intervention rather than having people maintained in the control condition for the entirety of the trial. So that's a very popular one that also is used quite frequently as well. The other comment I wish to say in terms of implementing interventions and strategies is to really think about the critical role of adaptation. And that, as we implement, generally, there's not like a sort of a fixed strategy that's done for every single person or every single group in the same exact way every time. There can be adaptations and changes to that implementation that are done at different stages of the implementation cycle. So one of the first papers related to thinking about adaptation was what's called the Adaptome, where we had ideas about quote unquote positive deviants that were contributory to beneficial outcomes, or negative drift or program drift, where it was like sort of adaptations or changes that happened that maybe weren't as positively associated with health outcomes. There was a way of thinking about different sources of the adaptation at the service setting, target audience, mode of delivery, et cetera, levels. Over time, actually, we have developed the implementation research community has developed several very comprehensive models now and approaches to documenting and evaluating adaptations and modifications. And so the FRAME-IS framework is one of those. As you can see, there are several different modules available to be able to try and really, in a detailed manner, document and evaluate and assess both the nature of these adaptations and modifications and their impacts. And so these are just a couple of slides sort of illustrating how detailed you can get with respect to this science of adaptation. Finally, thinking about evaluating outcomes and the sort of transdisciplinary nature of that evaluation as well. So implementation research, as we all know, is sort of far along the translational pathway, really thinking about real world implementation and practical uptake. And in the context of implementation research, traditionally, we think of these hybrid type 1 through type 3 designs. There will be other lectures subsequently describing those in full detail. But really, briefly, just to say that type 1, generally testing the clinical intervention while gathering information on implementation. On the other side of the spectrum, type 3, really testing the implementation strategy while gathering information on the clinical intervention. And type 2 is somewhere in between, in the middle. In the context, again, of BigPic, our trial was really a type 2 trial. We were very interested in health outcomes, cardiovascular risk reduction, and blood pressure reduction. But we also did a very comprehensive process evaluation as well. What we were able to show in our primary outcomes was that the group medical visit microfinance arm did lead to superior blood pressure reduction relative to usual care. However, the challenge in our case was that we had 4 arms in the trial, and so we had to adjust for multiple comparisons. And in order to do so, we had to now expand our confidence interval to a 98.3% confidence interval rather than a 95% confidence interval, which affected the confidence interval just barely crossed 0 here. But we did some subgroup analyses to show that those who were actively involved in the groups, or those who started off with quite severe uncontrolled blood pressure, did significantly benefit from the implementation strategy of group medical visits microfinance. We also, as I mentioned, did a comprehensive process evaluation, which we're in the process of writing up now. Again, there are many approaches to process evaluation. We use the Saunders approach, looking at various outcomes: fidelity, dose, engagement of participants, satisfaction, reach, and recruitment. And there are a variety of different data collection methods and time points that we used during the context of our trial, as illustrated here. And one thing I just wish to say is that we, in the context of our process evaluation, really tried to get a variety of different opinions and perspectives from different participant categories and different stakeholders, participants, community health workers, and clinicians. And as you can see here with this color-coded heat map, different participants had different categories of participants had different perceptions of these various process and implementation outcomes. And so I think it's very important to think about, in the context of process evaluation, getting as much feedback from a variety of different stakeholders as possible. We also did a cost effectiveness analysis, and really thinking now about the sort of economics side of things, where we used a Markov model here pictured on the left in order to be able to generate cost effectiveness ratios. And what we were able to show is that depending on the willingness to pay threshold, different strategies actually would be considered ideal. And so at the lower willingness to pay area, usual care was dominant. In the middle willingness to pay area, group medical visits alone were dominant. And then if you're able to or willing to pay a greater amount, actually the group medical visit microfinance model was the dominant cost-effective approach. And so this was actually a very nice way of working with our economics colleagues to really show the complexity and the subtlety of how cost-effectiveness analysis can be applied to implementation research as well. And so again, just wish to reiterate that implementation research is this transdisciplinary science, and I hope that I've been able to identify and illustrate to you, in the context of our very practical example of BigPic, how we have used that transdisciplinary approach. And so my key messages are, again, that implementation research is transdisciplinary, but really we're trying to achieve a common language among multiple disciplines to address a common issue, that there are multiple steps in an implementation research project. Each step itself can be transdisciplinary, and obviously the entirety of the project itself is also transdisciplinary. So with that, thank you very much.